The following is with David De Jong, who is the Middle East Correspondent for the Dutch newspaper FD. He lives in Israel and has been reporting from the ground since the early hours of October 7th. Some of you may recognize him from an early appearance he made in this podcast. There, he was talking about his book, Nazi Billionaires. But for this episode, we exclusively talk about David's first-hand experience over the last 2.5 weeks reporting on the ground. That includes the horror of being among the first reporters at some of the worst site hits from October 7th, through to the disinformation and how to think about the media coverage of this conflict so far. All links to follow David are in the chat. His Twitter is especially good because he is both tweeting his own takes, but as well retweeting those that he trusts. And also just one more thing, please, if you don't mind, sign up to my newsletter, which serves as a complement to the podcast, documenting the whole Curious Worldview backlog of guests and ideas so far. I launched it very recently, and I just want to encourage you all to join the community. It's the top link in this chat. And without any further ado, here is David De Jong. Good morning, Mr. De Jong.
Good morning, Ryan.
So I will have just introduced you to the audience again, for those might have listened to the first time around. You're the author of Nazi Billionaires, but you're also the Middle East correspondent for FD, which is the Netherlands' largest sort of financial newspaper. And you're posted in Israel. So you've been in Israel for the last several weeks. And just to open up with, how's it been? You've been writing multiple stories, but I think just a good place to start with asking you first-hand experience since October 7th.
Yeah, it's been. It's been surreal. It's been also just working 24/7. I think I cover the entire Middle East. I don't just cover Israel and Palestine. So, especially with this, so far I hadn't covered any conflict in the region. Well, I generally never covered a conflict before. I certainly never covered a regional conflict. I mean, the stories I usually do are about, anything from IPOs in the Gulf to economic crises in Lebanon and Turkey to, covering the judicial reforms in Israel up to now, or, doing stories in the occupied West Bank, or, of reporting in the occupied on settler violence, etc. I mean, all kinds of stuff. But yeah, I mean, everything changed on October 7th at 7 a.m. when, I was woken by the air raid alarm, and, jumped out of bed into the so-called mamad, which is a safe room in the apartment in Tel Aviv. And it became very quickly clear, and there were these reports, and we saw the first videos of kind of armed militias getting into, or, armed militants getting into Sderot, which is 2 kilometers from the border with the Gaza Strip. And nobody first realized that the scale. I would say I didn't first realize the scale of what was happening, because it was really trickling. The information was trickling in, but it was immediately it was clear. I mean, the text messages I sent to my boss of that morning, in Dutch, they let me actually pull them up, because it's quite. It's kind of history in the, it's history in real time in a way, unfortunately. I said to him, who's having the air raid alarm is going off. There's been more than 300 rockets fired from Gaza to Israel, and there's also a image of militants that have crossed the border and are shooting at civilians in Sderot. And then there's also apparently a building hit in Tel Aviv. This is going to be very likely war. And it was, I was very happy that he was awake, because It was 6:45. It was seven. It was, the time I sent it, it was 7:45 Israel time, so 6:45. On a Saturday morning, right? So, and yeah, from there it just it went, and then it was very quickly. It was a state of alert for war, and then yeah, I mean, the first day was just, I worked out of the office and I had to get a flak jacket and a helmet because I left it at somebody else's, and then I was in the cab and then the air raid alarm went off, and I was with the cab driver. We were like, "So what are we gonna do now?" And he said, "Maybe we should just keep driving, and it's safer." And after that, because of course it was a Saturday, in that sense it was lucky because there was no newspaper on Sunday, of course, because the weekend edition was over. So then we really got to work from Sunday on. And I think I had four bylines in the Monday newspaper, did four stories. Did a hostage story on Monday for Tuesday, and then Tuesday was the first, time I went into it was safe enough to go into the field to go to do a reportage. And I went to Reim, which is where the Trans Festival was held in the desert, where at least 260 people were murdered by Hamas militants, and I was with my colleague Christine Kensche from Weld and our fixer Ronit. And we got kind of strangely, at first I mean, there was a lot of, reporters luck in the sense that we got access first to things that had not been no any other journalists. Because thousands had flown in, right? But we had kind of one day ahead. Those correspondents who were based there had kind of one day ahead on the news cycle. So we drove down to Ofakim, and which is also close to the Gaza Strip, which has also been attacked, which is a kind of a sleepy desert town of about 30,000 people. And we walked into a store, and there was this guy told me, and this place was deserted, right? It's a town of a city of 30,000 people, and it was just like no one. And we walk into the store, and this guy told me, saying, we're doing a reportage on what happened at the festival and in the kibbutzes. And he's like, yeah, my best friend Itzik Budiashvili was the head of security at the festival, and he was murdered. And I'm gonna take you everywhere. I'm gonna take you all around to Ofakim, and then I'm gonna take you to Reim, and yeah, I mean, it's I mean, there were kind of bodies of dead militants were still lying in ditches, alongside the road from between the kibbutz Reim. So first first Tommy took us around Ofakim, and seeing, and there were just burned out carcasses of cars that the militants, that the Hamas fighters had used to attack Ofakim. There were, bullet holes everywhere, just damage everywhere, right? But this was quite a large city, right? This was also the place where this woman kept talking to kind of kept the terrorists at bay by speaking to them for like 15 hours. Right? I don't know if you heard that
No, I
story.
didn't hear that.
This incredible woman, and she was interviewed. And I think Biden even met with her, who like was holed up in her house with her husband, and she like spoke. She like kept giving somehow. She kept like giving cookies or like tea to the terrorists, and like she said, "Oh, I'll teach you. I want to learn Arabic." She kind of flattered them, and she kept them like at bay. And then finally, after 15 hours, the army came, and killed them, and she was released or something like that. And so we went to that house. But then we went to Reim, which is, a 10, 15, 20-minute drive from Ofakim. And, there was really kind of and that's, 4 kilometers, 2 miles from the Gaza border, from the border with the Gaza Strip. Yeah, and there were, the uncovered, often sometimes almost naked bodies of killed Hamas fighters in lying in ditches in this road between Kibbutz Reim and between the festival grounds. Now, at this point in time, of course, it was 3 days after it was 24 hours after it was Tuesday afternoon. So it was basically 24 to 48 hours since there had been no more kind of militants, since they declared it like safe, right? So, well, safe, I don't know. I mean, there were still, um, bodies were still being discovered on the festival site. So we didn't get access to the festivals because they were in still securing that site.
Was this the first time in your life that you'd seen dead bodies?
Yes, it was. Yeah, yeah. I'd never seen a dead body, not in my, not not in the context of saying goodbye to a loved one who had passed, or for any other reason. This is the first time that I consciously saw. I mean, it was very overt, right? It was a very overt display because, of course, as it was later explained to us, they first wanted to take care of the dead bodies of all of those that had been murdered before they would take care of the so-called Chablim, as they call it, as of the terrorists. And yeah, that road between the kibbutz Reim and the festival ground it was a hellscape. It was a hellscape. It's a sight I'm never gonna forget, never in my life. I mean, it was burned out cars, dead bodies. And there was this military checkpoint going into the festival grounds. So we ended up going to Kibbutz Reim, which was which had been attacked, which at that point was kind of which was kind of the front in a way. There was a lot of artillery around the field that there was constantly going off, or constantly artillery being shot at Gaza in these beautiful green fields around Reim, about Kibbutz Reim. Kibbutz Reim is a beautiful place, right? I mean, it was, the destruction I saw in there, and was incredible. I mean, just houses that had burned, a couple that had been burned alive with like in their house. You could smell the stench of human flesh. I mean, and also, but then some houses that had been completely left. They were in pristine state, and others that had been destroyed by the militants. And Reim, contrary to, say, Be'eri or Nir Oz or Hilot or Kfar Aza, had been comparatively, not spared is not the right word, right? But
Not as devastated.
not well. It had been devastated, but they had fewer casualties, right? Where Kfar Aza, Be'eri, you have 1/3 of the town or 10% of the town slaughtered, and the residents they spoke to ended up, what they said or those that had been there during the attack, said that we had to unlearn everything we learned in the military, which was to directly engage your enemy. And so we played this cat and mouse because it was 10 of the kind of the security, the protection unit of the kibbutz, right? Which is volunteers, um, against 50 militants. Um, and yeah, and they ended up only, quote unquote, 10 people being killed in the kibbutz, and one being kidnapped. But the destruction was just incredible. And it was all these SUV, all these Toyota pickups, which these Hilux pickups, burned crashed everywhere, and buildings that had just been, residences that have been just completely destroyed. And yeah, I mean, it was just destruction on an unimaginable scale. And it was a military zone. It was all soldiers there, and it was just when the mobilization had started. Right, this is tomorrow, 3 weeks ago, when we were there. It was October 10th, and yeah, so that was my first reportage on the. I mean, I been it was the first in the field reportage, and yeah, then the second one was at the northern border with Lebanon, that following Sunday. And in the meanwhile, of course, I had to do I had to cover the Biden visit. I was doing, all kinds of different stories, but ones that I could do from the office or from the bureau, or going to press conference. A lot of hostage stories. Um, deformity of the war cabinet with guns. And then, of course, kind of this story about how Israel changed forever. That after that first week. And then, of course, then I went up to the border with Lebanon, because that was, and to an extent is still, the fear, right, of a second front opening up as soon as the ground offensive, which has by now has been started. But I think I've you know I guess the expectations of a ground offensive were different, right? I thought perhaps people expected that it would have been more massive, um, or yeah, a bigger incursion.
You sort of just hinted at it a little bit, but can you speak to the sentiment change among Israelis in the last 3 weeks?
Let me, yeah, I will. I think it's very well highlighted by what I saw on the Lebanese border, on the border with Lebanon, right? So on Sunday, um, let me just see here. It was, yeah. So on October 14th, it was me, my colleague Christian Meyer from the Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung, the FAZ, and Omer, Israeli fixer, went first up to speak to a family which had been evacuated from Rosh Hanikra, which is literally on the border. These beautiful caves which are on the border with Lebanon, and they had been evacuated. And this family, like, and people of our age, there was a whole family of 11 living in an apartment, kind of having been moved to an apartment. And this family, they were quite, and that's also the cynicism of kind of those living in the envelope around Gaza. Um, a lot of them were left-wing peace activists, those that were considered peaceniks. And they, it's especially those living in, in Rosh Hashanah, those peaceniks, they had really changed their tune. They were suddenly, they had become bloodthirsty. Everything had to be destroyed, and I think for me, this change among, I mean, and I don't know how that sentiment is, whether that's still 3 weeks in the case, but in those first week, 10 days, 2 weeks, it was really this sense among the Israelis I spoke to, of there can never be a peace. We have to just we have to destroy Hamas, we have to destroy Hezbollah, we have to destroy Iran. You know, and I think, I don't know. I can't speculate. That's not my role to speculate on what's going to happen in the long term. But I think it will have a profound and lasting effect on the psyche, both of Israelis and Palestinians. Um, and after interviewing his family, we went up, and it happened to be the morning where they evacuated the first of 28 towns. I think by now it's been 42, or along the northern border with Lebanon. And we managed to get into the closed military zone, to this place called Mitzpah Hilah, which is a beautiful, again, a beautiful town, which overlooks this kind of mountain ridge that is the start of Lebanon. And this place was deserted, and and we had to, like with Kibbutz Reim, we really had to talk ourselves in, because it was completely protected by military. And and we were taking around the town. I mean, it was the same in Reim. We were taking around. Of course, this was not a town that Mitzpah was not destroyed, right? It was on the kind of, it was again on a front, but on a different front, on a front in waiting, as opposed to a front that was in action, which also turned out to not be true, because at one point, Hezbollah started firing rockets, and we saw them come down, from these kind of two ridges, because Mitzpah is also on a ridge and overlooks the Lebanese ridge. So we kind of saw it come down into the valley, and then there was artillery fire and phosphorus gas or phosphorus grenades being shot at Hezbollah positions. So it was yet again. I mean, when I say reporters' luck, I mean luck in the sense of, experiencing these things. Of course, it is not lucky in the sense of any kind of human experience or condition, right? I mean, it's a very twofold, very bittersweet experience. So yeah, so that was the first week, and then of course the narrative, quickly, I mean, well, not quickly, but the narrative started focusing on what was happening in Gaza and the occupied West Bank. All right, in addition to covering what's happening domestic with the efforts of hostage release and kind of the largest mobilization Israel has ever seen. So the third reportage I did was in the occupied West Bank, was these, kind of in the shadow of Gaza, emboldened settlers, backed by the army, that are, forcibly displacing, or particularly Bedouin villages, hundreds of people, hundreds of Palestinians from their villages. Because I mean, it is this kind of this cynic twist, right, where Netanyahu's government, the far right and ultra religious and ultra nationalist government that had been in power for the first 10 months and 2 weeks, the first 10 months and 10 days of this year, until the war cabinet was formed, focused so much on the West Bank, right? On expanding settlements, allowing settler violence to kind of occur unchecked or having the army backing that. Um, yeah, inciting violence against Palestinians in the occupied West Bank, etc., etc. Really ramping up and totally lost the focus on the Gaza Strip and on Hamas. Kind of saying we have this under control and blah blah blah, and completely thinking that they had it under control. And and it was, I mean, it was, a huge failure, of course, by the Shin Bet, by the domestic security services, because people talk about the Mossad, but the Mossad has nothing to do with focusing on Gaza, right? That's a purview of it's a purview of the Shin Bet, the domestic security services, and of course the army, which arrived way too late, right? As in Reim, the army showed up. The attack started at 7 a.m. The army showed up between noon and I think around 2 p.m. So it was eight. It was 7 hours later. And in places like Far Aza and near Oz and Beeri, it was even more. It was sometimes 16 hours, 17 hours before the army showed up while the attack was in progress. So but now in the shadow of Gaza, you have the settlers who are, you know, yeah, displacing hundreds of Palestinians in these villages. And we visited three villages. Um, and it was, in Wadi Sik and Muarajat and Ain Rashash, and it was, one where they had left, where they were forced to leave, one where they were also forced to leave but kind of refused to go in the sense that they're coming back, and thirdly, one where they're refusing to go. And it is, and they are, also supported by Israeli volunteers, by volunteers who are there 24/7. So the story was also partly about the fear among Israeli activists of, that like after the attacks of October 7th, like of the 50, only half showed up. And people were saying, well, they'll come back. Um, yeah. So it was this kind of twofold story of these displacements, of these forced expulsions, and but also of kind of Israeli activists doing their, you know, helping Palestinians even now. Yeah.
I wanted to ask you, David, because you're in a rather unique position, being an expat in the country,
Yeah.
but a foreign correspondent. So, like you said, really front of the line when it comes to the reporting. Uh, you wrote a piece, I think it was only a few days ago, called "It's Getting Harder for Jewish and Arab Israelis to Live
Yeah.
Together." So, to speak further to this sentiment change, the way you can see it as an outsider.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah, I mean, yeah, that's a nice full circle because that's the fourth reportage I did, and it's. I mean, there's an incredible fear, right? I think what Hamas seemed to have been banking on was that as soon as they attacked the occupied West Bank, would revolt against the, not only about the Israeli occupation but also against the Palestinian Authority, right? Which is led by Mahmoud Abbas, Abu Mazen, and is notoriously corrupt and in effect, and a lot of Palestinians speak about a double occupation, Israeli army plus PA. But people in the West Bank are scared, and but particularly, of course, I mean, they're used to kind of being about kind of indiscriminate arrests and administrative detention without any end. But of course, what's happening now in Israel, particularly since the war cabinet, yeah, took office, is that, Palestinians with an Israeli citizenship, of which there are about 2 million, are worried about, are fearing prosecution. Because they've expanded kind of the powers, the war cabinet has expanded powers of the police, and they've expanded the definition of one could be charged for terrorism, or support of terrorism, which means in some cases of um, a like of a post of the civilian casualties in Gaza, right? Or speaking out against, you know,
What would the consequences be if I'm an Israeli
well,
citizen,
yeah.
Palestinian
Well,
ethnicity, and I'm like
you
sharing a bunch of,
yeah, you
say,
get
pro
arrested.
Hamas stuff?
You could get fired from your job. There could be like a disciplinary proceedings. It could be an HR complaint against you. You could get fired. There's been stories of students who are now in for disciplinary committees for liking, pictures like that. There's been yeah, there's been stories about influencers that have been arrested or that are being contacted by the Shabak, by the Shin Bet, saying, you know, don't post this or that, and yeah, I mean that is a new reality for Arab Israelis, and of course also for those Jewish Israelis that have been working towards coexistence for decades, right? Who are also seeing their entire communities being torn apart, which of course, you know, this was already had like the country was already being torn apart for 10 months, right? Through because of the judicial reforms had pitted 40% of the country, which is centrist, left wing, liberal, against 40% of conservative or pro-Likud conservative, ultra-Orthodox, ultra-nationalist settlers. What you have it, and then this kind of 20% of Arab Israelis who didn't really engage with all of that debate because they're like, well, this is, we're in trouble either way, and that is something that I mean, again, I mean the conflict, I mean the attacks and the subsequent war between Israel and Hamas, it's 3 weeks, it's just over 3 weeks old, so this is what we're gonna see. I mean, we're gonna see so much, this is only the beginning of it's going to get, it's probably going to get worse before it's going to get better.
So, between you and your colleagues, when you are speaking about how things move forward from here, what
Yeah,
is the general consensus?
we we don't we tend not to speculate on that because we just don't know, and that's not our job. Our job is to report, but see what we going on. The 1400, you know, the 1400 that have been murdered in Israel. Reporting on the more than 230 hostages in Gaza, on the 8,000, I think by now 8,000 civilian casualties. Well, it's not only civilian casualties; it also includes militants and terrorists.
Mm.
Casualties in Gaza, the tens of thousands of wounded there. I mean, that's a whole nother story, right? Is how to report on Gaza, which is one of the most extreme challenges we
Mm.
have,
How do
right?
you tackle that?
You talk to people within Gaza who are risking their lives talking to you, not because you're a journalist based in Israel, because you're a journalist at all, right? And that's if any of the kind of the security forces of Hamas or of the Islamic Jihad finds out that people are talking to journalists, it's I mean they control. I mean I think what's being badly explained, and I've also not done a good job at it yet. Hamas is a government, right, in Gaza. They control the Gaza Strip, right? They are the government. They provide the services, right? and that is and they control every aspect of life. And even though there's only 30,000, 40,000, an estimated um, Hamas fighters, Hamas militants, terrorists, whatever you want to call them, and 10,000 Islamic Jihad fighters, which makes for so the armed militias for about 50,000. There's also a political bureau. There's these they are the government. It's just like we talk about the Taliban as a government. I mean, as a regime. I mean, they're a regime, and I think that is often forgotten. It's because if you talk about militants, if you talk about terrorists, like how can they run like one of the most densely populated places? But that's what they do. They provide services. The hospitals are run by Hamas. It's like everything in power is Hamas, right? I mean that's the power that is there, and that's the power you have to deal with, and that's the power that they rule it with an iron fist, and and you know um, yeah. So yeah, sorry.
What about, say, the social stigma within Israel? So you've been
Mhm.
traveling all over the country, but presumably you maintain lots of conversations with people throughout Tel Aviv,
Sure,
not all of them being the ultra nationalist conservative,
for
presumably
sure.
a lot of them being on the left.
Yeah.
Is there a sort of social stigma to the Jews that you're speaking to who are not like totally getting on board with what the consensus narrative is?
No, there's no social stigma. I mean, especially now, especially the people I'm talking to, Bibi is so across the board unpopular, right? I mean, he focused so much on of kind of his self survival. Of he has these three corruption processes going against him. He teamed up with the most extreme factions. He tried in a democratic way to overturn democracy in Israel, and he divided the country so much and left it so weakened that they hit at a moment when it was just when Israel was at its weakest. And in the end, Netanyahu is the one who's as the commander in chief, also as the executive for the army, for the security services, is responsible for it. And of course, he had to form this war cabinet with his biggest rival and the opposition leader Benny Gantz and his Ministry of Defense. I mean, this triumvirate is now Yoav Gallant. This triumvirate is now running the country because he had his back against the wall. It was either he had to resign immediately or team up with his biggest with his biggest competitor. And I think you know and now there's day and night. There's there are demonstrations outside of Hakiria, which is the Ministry of Defense and also the headquarters of the Israeli army, of the IDF, the Israeli Defense Force, and in central on Kaplan, which is where the demonstrations were also held, the Saturday night demonstrations for 10 months. And now there's day and night people just protesting. The families of the more than 230 that are being held hostage, right? Saying bring them home now, arguing for a ceasefire in order to bring the hostages home safely, which are both for large part Israelis with second nationalities, as well as foreign workers, right? Um, Then there are those that are there demanding for a ceasefire, that are saying this is, that are arguing for a humane, end to this conflict. How which is how hard that is to even given the current war sentiments. And then there are those who are fearing, of course, a ground offensive will end up costing the lives of hundreds of Israeli soldiers. as well as just untold civilian casualties in Gaza, which is already happening on both sides, and want a ceasefire. And then there's also right wing demonstrations who are saying reoccupy Gaza, expel 2.2 million Palestinians to Egypt, to the Sinai, let them roam there. And so what's happening now in Kaplan is really a is it's 20, and a lot of people demonstrating were saying Bibi has to resign now. you this is his responsibility. And yeah, I mean that and it is incredible how Kaplan has become this continuing hotbed of demonstrations, of protests, and it's really 24/7 these days.
What do you make of the media coverage, as much as you've been able to consume as well as create?
I mean, it's not really my role to judge on the work of colleagues. That's just not. That's it. I'm too much in it to. I know we're all under a tremendous amount of pressure in the field, and I know that you know we're all doing the best job we can under what is also in part of a propaganda war from both sides, which one has to balance. It's a very fine balance that one has to engage in, with reporting, because there's a lot of disinformation out there, a lot of misinformation out there, and one has to thread very carefully and verify everything. And I think my colleagues have been doing an incredible job out in the field. What I do say is that, particularly from those, it's very hard from foreign desks who are not in the country making judgment calls on, for example, the bombing of the hospital, right, where everybody rushed to judgment based on a Hamas statement, which they didn't know, and they didn't verify that it was an Israeli, and it was on all the front pages the next day, and it was just so incredibly harmful and insidious, that go unchecked. And I mean, the New York Times issued a huge rectification, but a lot of the Dutch media, for example, didn't, who carried the same story, and that of course inflames the debate so much, because I'm focused on the Middle East, I'm focused on the region, I'm focused on Israel, Palestine, Lebanon, and the region beyond at the moment. But of course, the domestic debates, in particularly Netherlands and Germany, have been just so toxic, and you see all these, social media warriors coming out and being just basing themselves on terrible information and saying just the and attacking my colleagues, attacking myself, threats over emails and things like that over social media, and it's you know but that's a different debate. That's not that is not my focus, because I can separate that. My focus is on the Middle East. My focus is that's my job. That's what I'm focusing on. What's happening in Israel, Palestine, and Lebanon, and Egypt, and whatever countries, and Qatar, and Saudi, and Iran, and all of their, it's a big geopolitical game, and yeah.
What realities about the Middle East have been revealed to you in the last 3 weeks that you perhaps beforehand, didn't fully appreciate?
I mean, none really, because I mean, I've gotten to appreciate the region more, as strange as this sounds, because of it, because of this. That sounds really strange, but um, there's such humanity in this incredible suffering and destruction as well, and through it all, and people are trying to live with dignity. People are trying to protect the lives of their families, and you know, and I think you see in this conflict particularly, it's just that inhabitants are are victims of their regimes, you know, whether it's Hezbollah, which is a state within a state in Lebanon, whether it's Hamas in the Gaza Strip, whether it's the PA or the IDF in the occupied West Bank, or to an extent, by the failures of the Netanyahu government in protecting its own citizens, you know. Yeah.
We'll leave it there. Your Twitter bio is in the description for people to follow. Things that you retweet and stuff. It's a good way to, I don't know, at least just consume reliable media about the conflict. Are there other places you would encourage people to look at, whether it's a podcast, you know, a certain interviewer, a certain journalist who you think is just who you think is doing good coverage and therefore, you know, should be consumed?
I mean, I think on the, you know, I think on the Israeli side, you know, I think Haaretz is doing an incredible job. You know, and I do have to say, I mean, but I'm saying the same for my colleagues at you know, Al Jazeera, CNN, the Wall Street Journal, Bloomberg, Reuters, AP. You know, it's hard to highlight one. My colleague and friend Raf Sanchez at NBC has been working nonstop for the past 3 weeks, you know, and is doing incredible stories. You know, my colleague and friend Willem Marks for Al Jazeera is doing just really very incredibly reliable coverage. And, you know, all my German colleagues, and there's not that many Dutch correspondents out in Israel and Palestine anymore. But but there are also those that are left, or those that flew in are also doing incredible work. So it's really yeah, it's you know, it's also a communal effort of the media at this point, is to get to cover the story as best as it can, and I think to a large extent it is doing that. And but yeah, I mean, it's an incredibly hard environment to work in, both security wise. Yeah, yeah.
All right, David. Well, good luck, mate, and we'll keep reading what you're writing and maybe check in a few weeks again.
Sounds good. Thank you, Ryan.